August 6, 1945. The sun had barely risen over Hiroshima when the world changed forever. Not with a declaration, not with a warning, with a single bomb dropped from 6 miles above a city of 350,000 ordinary people. People who were eating breakfast, walking to work, sending their children to school, who had no idea that the last normal morning of their lives was already over. Within 43 seconds, everything was gone. Hiroshima in the summer of 1945 was a city that believed it had been forgotten by the war. The American firebombing campaigns had already reduced dozens of Japanese cities to ash. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, city after city had burned through 1944 and into 1945. But Hiroshima had been largely untouched. There were theories, half hopeful, half desperate, that the Americans were preserving it for some strategic purpose. Perhaps a prisoner of war camp. Perhaps a future occupation headquarters. The people of Hiroshima did not know that their city had been specifically selected as a target precisely because it was intact, because the United States needed to see clearly and without ambiguity what their new weapon could do. On the morning of August 6th, an air raid warning had sounded and then been called off. A small number of American planes had been spotted. Too few, the authorities decided, to constitute a serious attack. People returned to their routines. The all clear had been given. At 8:15 in the morning, the Enola Gay released Little Boy from an altitude of nearly 31,000 feet. The bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the city center. What followed has no adequate description in any language. The temperature at the hypocenter, the point directly below the explosion, reached several thousand degrees in a fraction of a second. Everything within half a mile was incinerated before the human nervous system could process that anything had happened. Buildings that had stood for generations collapsed and then caught fire. The shock wave moved outward at the speed of sound, shattering windows miles away, hurling people through walls, collapsing everything that the initial blast had weakened. Within hours, individual fires had merged into a single firestorm that consumed what remained. 70,000 people were dead before noon. Read that again. 70,000 people before noon. By the end of 1945, as radiation sickness claimed those who had survived the initial blast, the death toll would climb to 140,000. And the world had not yet seen the second bomb. 3 days later, on August 9th, before Hiroshima had finished burning, a B-29 named Boxcar dropped Fat Man over Nagasaki. The bomb was more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The hills surrounding Nagasaki contained much of the blast, a geographical accident that saved lives while simultaneously trapping survivors in a valley of fire. 40,000 people died instantly. 80,000 were dead by the end of the year. Japan surrendered 6 days later. The war that had consumed the world for nearly a decade was over, but for the people standing in the ruins of two cities, the ending of a war was almost beside the point. They were still trying to understand what had been done to them. Among the survivors of Hiroshima was a 20-year-old student named Sunao Tsuboi. He was on his way to his university when the bomb detonated. The blast threw him to the ground and left him with severe burns across much of his body. He lay in the rubble for hours before help reached him. The doctors who eventually treated him did not expect him to survive. The burns alone should have been fatal. And then, in the weeks that followed, came something the doctors had no framework for. The slow, invisible damage of radiation working through his body in ways that medicine in 1945 could observe but not explain or treat. Sunao Tsuboi survived. He went on to become a teacher. He married. He raised a family. And for the rest of his long life, he lived to the age of 96, dying in 2021. He told his story to anyone who would listen, not out of bitterness, though he had every right to bitterness, but because he believed, with a conviction that never left him, that silence was the most dangerous thing a survivor could choose, that the only way his survival carried meaning was if it prevented someone else from experiencing what he had experienced. He spent his final decades standing before audiences around the world, school children, diplomats, heads of state, and saying the same thing in the same quiet voice: "This must never happen again." The Japanese word for the atomic bomb survivors is Hibakusha. It means, roughly, explosion-affected people. But the word carries weight that the translation cannot fully hold, because the Hibakusha did not simply survive an explosion. They survived an event that continued to damage them for decades afterward, through radiation-related cancers, through the chronic illnesses that appeared years and sometimes decades after the bomb, through the profound psychological weight of having witnessed the destruction of an entire city in a single moment. And then they survived something almost as damaging, the stigma. In post-war Japan, the Hibakusha found themselves quietly set apart from the society they had survived into. There were fears, irrational but persistent, that radiation sickness might be contagious. Survivors struggled to find marriage partners. Employers were reluctant to hire them. Insurance companies refused to cover them. They were the living reminders of something Japan was trying desperately to move past. And the country's discomfort with that reminder was projected onto the very people who had suffered most. They had walked out of the ashes, and then they had to survive the peace. There is a 12-year-old girl named Sadako Sasaki whose story has become inseparable from Hiroshima itself. She was 2 years old when the bomb fell, young enough to survive the initial blast, close enough to the hypocenter to carry its consequences in her body for the rest of her life. In 1955, a decade after the bombing, she was diagnosed with leukemia, a direct result of her radiation exposure as a toddler. She was 12 years old and she was dying, and she knew it. There is a Japanese legend that says if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, your wish will be granted. Sadako folded cranes from her hospital bed. She folded them from every scrap of paper she could find. Medicine wrappers, get-well cards, whatever was within reach. She folded them with the focused determination of a child who's decided that hope is worth the effort, even when the evidence argues otherwise. She died before she reached 1,000. Her classmates folded the rest. Sadako Sasaki never lived to see the world she hoped for, but the image of a child folding paper cranes against the approaching dark has outlasted almost everything else from that era. Statues of her stand in peace. Parks around the world. Children send paper cranes to Hiroshima by the millions every year. An ongoing, unbroken act of collective hope that has continued for 7 decades and shows no sign of stopping. Hiroshima rebuilt itself. Within months of the surrender, people were returning. Within years, construction had begun in earnest. In 1949, the Japanese government designated Hiroshima a peace memorial city, a formal declaration that the city would be defined by what had happened there, that it would carry the memory forward rather than bury it. The atomic bomb dome, the skeletal ruins of a building near the hypocenter that somehow remained partially standing after the blast, was preserved exactly as the bomb had left it. It stands in the middle of a modern, thriving city today, surrounded by office buildings and parks, and the sound of ordinary life as the most honest piece of architecture in the world. Japan itself rebuilt with a speed that astonished economists and historians alike. By the 1960s, the economy was growing faster than almost anywhere on Earth. By the 1980s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world, a nation that had been reduced to rubble in 1945 and had become, within a single generation, one of the most prosperous countries in human history. But prosperity is not the same as healing. The Hibakusha knew this. They had always known this. The last of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors are leaving the world now, one by one, in their 80s and 90s, taking with them the lived memory of the worst thing a weapon has ever done to a city full of ordinary people on an ordinary morning. Sunao Tsuboi is gone. Setsuko Thurlow, who was 13 years old when Hiroshima burned and who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of nuclear disarmament activists in 2017, is still alive, still speaking, still insisting that the world has not yet fully reckoned with what happened on those 2 August mornings. What the Hibakusha leave behind is not just memory, it is testimony. It is the paper crane. It is the preserved ruin of a building that the world tried to erase and couldn't quite manage to. It is the stubborn, fragile, still standing hope that humanity is capable of learning, really learning, from the worst of what it has done. In 1945, 2 cities walked out of the ashes. They are still walking, and the least the rest of the world can do, the very least, is remember why.